Hello, and welcome to tonight's bedtime story. I'm so glad you're here. It's time to unwind, let go of the day's worries, and settle into a comfortable space. Take a deep breath in, and as you breathe out, feel the tension in your body begin to melt away. Tonight, I'll guide you on a gentle journey that will help you drift off into a peaceful and restful sleep. So, close your eyes, relax, and let's begin. Roy hadn't picked a moonless night on purpose, but as he climbed under his blanket and lay his head on his saddle, he was glad for the happy accident. Out on the range, the only place he felt truly at home, no moon meant stars. Thousands, if not millions of them, stared back at him as he contemplated his life choices, especially the one that waited for him at dawn. A cowpuncher by trade, just as his father and grandfather before him, Roy had spent more nights than he could count far from the lights of the city. In fact, the quiet lowing of a herd had become almost a necessity for Roy to fall asleep, always with one ear open, as any good hand would. Tonight, however, all he had to keep him company was his faithful steed, Lightning, and the stars. "I'm at the end of my rope," Ron thought to himself, chuckling at the irony. Whereas others might not be able to pinpoint the moment their lives went wrong, Roy had no such quandary. He was a cowboy, not a rancher, but with a wife and young daughter to think about, he had sold everything, mortgaged what he could, and borrowed the rest to buy the land he had worked on since he was a boy. That was before the drought, the recession, and the cancer ruined his plans. In the space of months, he lost his wife, his herd, and his good name, a gift presented to him by his father, just as it had been passed down from his grandfather. Tomorrow was his last day before the bank's foreclosure, his last day as a rancher, and because of his decision to tie things up neatly, his last day. The plan was simple. All it required was a rope, a tree, and 2 buckets. As a lifelong cowboy, Roy never went anywhere without a rope and, as fortune would have it, there was a lone tree far enough from the ranch house to give him the privacy he needed. 2 sturdy metal buckets were easy enough to find in the barn to bring with him on his journey. The first warming rays of dawn hold special meaning to cowboys. They are a physical reminder of the immutable contact between man and nature. On the range, there is no need for alarm clocks or wake-up calls. God, in His infinite wisdom, set in motion the hourglasses for those who lived off the land when He separated day and night with the rising and setting suns. On this day, dawn came both alarmingly quick and painfully slow to Roy, but as soon as the sun peeked its head over the horizon, the lonely cowboy put his plan in motion. Fashioning the end of a rope into a noose is an art form most will never master. It's a knot that only has one purpose, and the history of the same is decidedly unpleasant. Roy, the consummate planner, hadn't left the task to chance. He had tied and untied the knot more times than he could count, but it was the exact number of times it took to do so perfectly. Now with the end, he easily completed the task before throwing the knotted end of the rope over the sturdiest limb and tightly securing the other end to the trunk. The first bucket was then carefully placed directly under the rope. Exact measurements had been calculated and executed to allow for a man to stand on the pail and just be able to reach the method of his demise. After completing his first task, Roy turned his attention to a much more important one, filling the second bucket with water. He had no way of knowing how long it might be before someone might happen upon the scene, but no cowboy worth his salt would leave his horse thirsty. Roy knew that horses, left to their own devices, could find a water hole or stream without too much difficulty, but the bucket and water were his way of showing his friend love even as he prepared to die. Roy often wondered what went through a man's mind when he stared down death. He had been present the day his father passed, and had held his wife's hand at the exact moment she left him, but this was the first time he had faced the end himself. To his surprise, he had no feelings of anxiousness or regret as he climbed up on the bucket and secured the noose around his neck. In fact, as he looked to his left and then his right, Roy was struck by the beauty of the range first thing in the morning. There are worse ways for a cowboy to die, he thought to himself. Then he heard it. A nicker, the soft, low-pitched sound a horse makes when he wants your attention. Roy opened his eyes to see Lightning staring back at him. As soon as the horse and man's eyes locked, Lightning turned his gaze towards the second bucket, the one left specifically for him. In an instant, Lightning kicked the bucket over, spilling its contents into the dirt. As the water soaked into the ground, rendering its contents useless, the horse returned its gaze to Roy. A horse and cowboy share a bond unknown to those who spend their lives in cities. They know each other's clues, both verbal and silent. It's a language, as real as any and in a way that only Roy could understand. Lightning told the man that if this was their chosen destination, then the two of them would take the last ride together. In that moment, everything changed. Roy had lost so much in his life, but he hadn't lost everything. The sun, now fully above the horizon, shone on Roy as he reached up and removed the rope from his neck. He then quickly undid the knot of death and placed it and his saddle back where they belong. He left the two buckets exactly where they were, a reminder of the power of hope. Then, the two of them, man and horse, rode back towards the ranch house to fight another day. Distance and time, that's how adults measure journeys. But because we were just boys, distance didn't matter and time didn't exist. Now, as I retraced the familiar path of my youth, the path that led to our tree, I realized that the distance hadn't changed, but the journey that used to take 30 minutes had taken me 12 years. The turnoff to the trail was still hidden. I was glad about that. It's what made our place secret. There were also short stretches where the route had been covered by overgrowth and the canopy of trees that surrounded me, as I walked, obscured everything except for my childhood memories. The path, like most I've walked, was anything but straight, but the light at the end was as bright and warm as ever. When I entered the clearing we had discovered all those years ago, I looked to my left and saw our tree, almost exactly as we had left it. It had grown quite a bit in 20 years, so had I. Yet, standing there, looking up at the familiar limbs, I felt like a little boy again and smiled, and remembered. We were three young boys who didn't know we were different. We all liked frogs and didn't like girls, and that's pretty much all that mattered. Still, the real reason we became friends was probably the result of a statistical anomaly. We were all born on October 1st. It seemed as if our friendship was destined. Keegan, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed golden child, was an old soul, organized to a fault, as everything he owned was always in its assigned place. He was a meticulous planner, and the de facto leader of our little group. As for Tommy, well, he was the rich kid, but you'd never know it to look at him. He wore Toughskins jeans and Ked sneakers and always looked like he needed a haircut. Yet he was a fearless defender of the downtrodden and the unquestioned heart of JTK, as we called ourselves. The J was for Jason, that's me. I was the very definition of average. You might even say forgettable, so much so that even I don't even remember what I was known for. But for some reason I fit in with Keegan and Tommy, and on our 10th birthday we found the tree. Let's go for a walk. That's how our journey began. I think it was Tommy's idea, but I can't say for sure. It was, however, a perfect day for exploring the woods, sunny with a crisp breeze. The leaves had started to turn bright orange and red, and those that were already on the ground made the crinkling sound of fall. Sticks we found became swords, and for a moment we were pirates engaged in duels, shouting things like, "Avast ye matey!" and "ARR!" We spent many a day in those woods, so much so we considered ourselves experts. but we had never seen the trail that led to the tree, not until that day. Being young and fearless, we did as boys usually do, we investigated. When we came to a clearing at the end of the path, Keegan and I ran into the opening as if we were trying to win a race. Tommy, who walked in more slowly to take in this new secret place, saw the tree first. In a flash, he navigated up the perfectly placed branches. Where others might have seen a challenge, Tommy saw an opportunity. He was always reaching higher, and the tree seemed as if it was made for him to climb. Keegan, as he was wont to do, decided we should build a fort and began barking orders. He had it all worked out. We could use the boughs and branches that were plentiful in the field to create the shell of what would become our hangout. We never minded when he took charge, as he was a benevolent dictator, always doing the most work and doing it well. We didn't get very far when Tommy yelled, "Oh my gosh! You guys won't believe this!" Within seconds, Keegan and I made our way up the tree to see what was so important. "Look over there," Tommy said, pointing to the west. "It's my house." Then he turned and pointed north. "And Jason, there's your father's hardware store." I was surprised at how small everything looked from the top of our tree. "There's our school and my house right behind it," Keegan exclaimed, imploring Tommy and I to look. "We can see everything from here," Tommy said softly. "This is our place and our tree, now and forever." Keegan and I nodded our heads in agreement. The rest of that day was adolescent boy perfection. We built a makeshift fort, one we improved upon with each subsequent trip. Throughout the years, boughs, branches, and leaves were replaced with boards, nails, and an old windowpane Keegan had borrowed from his dad. That first day we stayed much later than we should have, but we were able to sit together and watch the sunset while drinking juicy juice grape juice boxes, just being boys and becoming lifelong friends. It was Tommy who came up with the idea just before we started back. "Let's spend every birthday here together. It's a deal." I agreed instantly. "I'm in," Keegan added. "It has to be a promise," Tommy insisted. "I promise," I responded, holding my hand up like a witness in court. "I promise too," Keegan joined in, with conviction. Then we all shook hands and the covenant was complete. Young boys make and break promises easily, but we were true to our word for the next 8 years. There was one time we practically had to carry Keegan to the tree because he'd broken his leg playing football, and another time when Tommy dragged me there 3 weeks after my dad died. I had been inconsolable and isolated. That birthday, at the tree, was the beginning of my healing. Tommy knew I needed to be there even if I didn't. It was an act of love, not common at our age, and one I'll never forget. Yes, we were always there on our birthday with juicy juice grape juice boxes at sunset. Then, as is always the case, 3 boys became young men. Keegan left for college in California, becoming an electrical engineer. Tommy joined the army, doing almost 2 full tours in Iraq. He had a servant's heart and a hero's soul, though we always heard of his selfless deeds secondhand. I wasn't made for college or the military, so I stayed in town and worked at my family's hardware store. We made one last promise on our 18th birthday. We'd meet at the tree on our 30th birthday, watch the sunset, and drink one more juice box together. It was a promise between best friends and a commitment to stay that way. When Keegan called me last week, I shouldn't have been surprised. Like I said, he's always been the planner. I thought it would be impossible to keep our promise, but Keegan would have none of it. He would drive cross-country to be there on October 1st, and he intended to pick up Tommy on the way. I had just one job, to bring the juice boxes, juicy juice grape as always. I arrived early. I wanted time to reflect, but I soon heard footsteps coming through the paths we had explored as children. I turned to see Keegan walking towards me, reverently holding Tommy's urn. No words were spoken. Keegan and I just sat down silently and stuck the straws in our juice boxes. Then the three of us watched the sunset together, just as we had promised. The bar was dark, as a bar should be. That didn't bother John. In fact, it was one of the reasons he had stopped by for a drink. The last 4 years had all made sense to him. Boy met girl. Boy fell in love. Happily ever after. It had been a fairy tale to be sure, until tonight. She wanted roses at their wedding, yet his mom wanted lilies. If you really want to make a bride to be angry a week before her big day, try changing one of the major decisions at the last moment to please your mother. John learned that the hard way. Somehow, he knew he should have sided with his fiancée, but he'd spent most of his 23 years saying yes to his mom. After all, it was just flowers. John had obviously miscalculated. After the ensuing skirmish with the women in his life, he wasn't sure there would be a wedding. The only things he was sure of were that he needed a drink, and he wanted to be alone. The first was no problem. He was in a bar and over 21. The second was a little more problematic. "Is this seat taken?" John scanned the bar before answering. The question practically echoed as the bar was nearly empty. The stool next to his was, in fact, currently unoccupied. Well, no," John replied, using his hesitation as a signal that the stranger should find another seat. "Thanks, my friend. I'm Scott. Pleased to meet you," replied the man as he sat down and ordered a beer. John hoped that the stranger, now sitting beside him at the bar, would drink his beer quietly and leave. No such luck. "What brings you here?" Scott asked, taking the first sip of his beer. "I don't know about you, but today has been rough for me. I'm feeling kind of lost." "You have no idea," John replied, in a whisper he hoped Scott would ignore. "Do tell." "Honestly, I'd rather not," John answered, darkness hiding a flush of resentment. "Understood," Scott responded, returning to his beer. For the next few minutes, the strangers sat next to each other in uncomfortable silence until Scott spoke again. "Listen, my friend. We're both in a bar in the middle of the day, drinking alone. We might as well make the best of it, so lay it on me. Why is today so bad?" John had a decision to make. Should he engage the stranger in conversation or shut the whole thing down? It was obvious Scott needed to talk. Somewhere deep inside, John knew he did too. "I'm getting married a week from Saturday," John said, "and I just had the worst fight with my fiancée. Fights before marriages are common. Don't let it worry you," Scott reassured him. "What was it about?" "Flowers," John answered. "Roses versus lilies. Honestly, I couldn't care less. I just want to marry the love of my life." "Is that too much to ask?" "Roses," Scott replied as if he were speaking to himself. "A dozen roses." "That sounds like a story begging to be told," John interjected, knowing he would much rather listen to another man's sob story than tell one of his own. "If you share it, I'll buy you a beer." Without waiting, John signaled the bartender to refill both glasses. "A dozen roses, you say?" "It's actually a story about one woman, 3 men, and a dozen roses, but nevertheless I accept your offer." The 2 men clinked their beer mugs together, a stranger's contract signed. "The day she was born was anything but ordinary," Scott began. Her mother had been pregnant once before, but her first child was stillborn. The devastation made the young couple fearful during their second pregnancy. Until the little girl was safely in her mother's arms, either spoke of the future. Her father had been so cautious that he hadn't even bought a gift for his daughter, who now slept soundly on her mother's chest. This, of course, would not do, So he hurried to the hospital gift shop where he bought the most beautiful thing in the store, a single red rose. A single rose? Trust me, Scott said, chuckling. By the end of my story, you'll have your beer's worth and a dozen roses. Excuse me, John responded as he bowed slightly, waving his hand like a game show host. Please continue. I think I will, Scott responded with a melancholy smile. You see, every girl is beautiful in her father's eyes, but this daughter was a little bit of a late bloomer. Scott wrinkled his forehead, deep in thought. When she turned 13, just like most 13-year-old girls, she was hopelessly in love. With more courage than sense, she invited the object of her affection to her birthday party. To hers and everyone else's surprise, he agreed. Oh no, I think I know what's coming. Exactly, Scott replied, shaking his head. She told everyone she knew the good news. But he never showed up, John interrupted. Yep. That's awful. Yes, but it's also the story of the second rose. You see, her dad, having been around the block a time or two, was afraid that would happen. Scott took a sip of his beer, interrupting his own story. You're going to be a dad someday, and my advice is, be prepared. Scott paused to allow a moment for John to contemplate before continuing. Now where was I? Her crush didn't show up at the party. Oh, that's right. So, the story of the rose had been told at picnics, family gatherings, and holidays, ever since the day she was born, so when her dad knocked on her door and came in holding a single red rose, it made a sad girl smile and a very bad situation not quite so bad. That's a good man there, John said, offering Scott a small smile. That's 2 roses down. You still owe me 10. I'm getting there, Scott assured him. As I said before, she hadn't really come into her own at 13. That was not the case at 18. She had become a head-turner and had more than a few invitations to go to the senior prom, but she declined all but one. I think she knew that particular offer came from the young man who would become her husband. High school sweethearts. It was storybook perfect, and 5 years after getting her second rose, her dad gave her the third rose as she left for her special night. It was a father's way of saying he approved of her date without using any words. She may have married him without the rose and her father's endorsement, but we'll never know for sure. I hope their wedding went better than I expect mine will. Like I said, don't worry. All weddings are stressful. I'm sure yours will be fine. From your mouth to God's ears, John sighed. So, what's the story behind the next rose? I think you'll appreciate this one. It was on her wedding day, and a little like your fiancé, she was angry and hurt that her mom had made most of the important decisions. Her dad found her sitting alone, and as only a dad can, he fixed it with another red rose. With all the chaos of the day, that one red rose brought her back to the simplicity of it all. 2 people who loved each other. The rest was just background noise. She didn't know it at the time, but it was also the last rose she would ever get from her father. Wait, you promised a dozen roses. I did, Scott admitted, but I also told you it involved 3 men. I'm sorry, John said sheepishly, more invested in Scott's story than he had realized. Go on. Scott took a long overdue sip of his beer and continued. They call the first year of marriage the honeymoon phase because it's expected that couples will be lost in wedded bliss. But it's also the time when the worst fights happen. Don't tell me that, John said, rubbing his eyes. I was hoping this fight tonight would be the worst. Trust me, you're going to look back on this fight and laugh, Scott replied with certainty. In fact, most of your marital fights will be forgotten as long as you remember one thing. What's that? Never say anything you can't take back. When you're in the middle of a fight with someone you love, winning isn't the goal. Forever is. John sighed. turning to glance at his reflection in the mirror behind the bar before looking back towards Scott. So, there was a big fight? About what? Well, the important thing isn't what the fight was about. It's how it was handled. She walked out the door, got into her car, and headed to her parents' home. She was met at the door by her dad. In tears, she told him all about the kerfuffle between the sobs. After listening intently, her father went and got the next rose? No, I told you the one at the wedding was the last rose from her dad. He went and got his car keys and left his daughter with her mom. She didn't know it at the time, but he went to talk to her new husband. Although the conversation was just between the two men, it's assumed her dad shared the story of the flowers, as that was the day the rose tradition was passed down. Less than an hour later, her father and husband both drove up together. Her dad and mom went into the kitchen while her husband presented her with a single red rose. No words needed to be spoken. It wasn't their last fight, but it was the last one that would require a rose. So, her husband was the second man in your story? He was, Scott confirmed. That brings us to the next rose, which was the most bittersweet. Oh no. Yeah, there is no good way to lose a parent. The call came in the middle of the night. Her mom didn't have to give any details. They didn't matter. There had been an accident, and the girl's father was gone. There is a bond between a father and daughter that is impossible to explain, but if you ever have a daughter, you'll understand. Arrangements needed to be made and details needed to be ironed out, but right after the funeral, in that quiet time when there is nothing left to do, that's when the weight of loss truly hits. A good man knows when to talk and when to be silent, and she was married to a good man. She would say in later years she should have known, but the rose he presented genuinely surprised her. Of all the 12, that one was her favorite. That's amazing, John said, wiping away a tear. I hope I can be such a man. I'm sure you will be, Scott encouraged. I have a feeling about you. Thanks. The important thing to know, John continued, is not every occasion deserves a rose. The next one came on their first anniversary. It was his way of telling her that, as far as he was concerned, the honeymoon would never end. Be careful, Scott. You're giving me hope that all might be okay. I told you. So what comes next? Well, that rose was followed by the one she always said had brought her the most joy. She would only have one child, a son, and on the day he was born, her husband presented her with another red rose. Was he the third man you spoke of, her son? He was, but don't get ahead of the story. You're right. I promise I'll just listen. The two men broke out into laughter. So, that was the last rose for many years. The next one, however, was the most exotic. 25 years of marriage is quite an accomplishment, and in honor of the occasion, her husband planned a secret trip for the two of them to Hawaii. When she tells the story, she smiles broadly, recounting tales of blue water and white sand. She laughs hysterically about the wave that pulled her husband's swimsuit completely off. She speaks in hushed tones when she reminisces about the sunset as they walked along the beach, but she truly shines when she talks about the rose. I honestly wonder if she would have been as happy if she only gotten that one. Noted, John said with a smile as he used his finger to pretend he was writing reminders on a cocktail napkin. Though he was joking with Scott, he wasn't with the plan. He decided when he was married for 25 years, he was taking his wife to Hawaii. That's 9 roses, only 3 to go. Yes, 3 to go, Scott confirmed, but John could tell he said it with a touch of sadness. That was the last rose her husband would ever give her. I'm not sure if I should tell you about the next one, considering you're about to get married. You have your beer, and a deal is a deal, John said, trying to reassure Scott. He needed to hear the end of the story. "You're right," Scott continued, a little distracted. Her husband had plans to give her a rose on their 50th anniversary, but he came up 2 years short. The cancer hit fast and it hit hard. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, he was gone. Not since the day her dad died had she been so devastated. No marriage is perfect, but theirs was perfectly imperfect. Afterward, she was lost, unmoored. Her eyes and ears worked, but she didn't see or hear anything until her son asked her to join him in the family room. Everyone knew the story of the roses, but only one man could continue the tradition, and continue it her son did, as he presented her with a single red rose. In an instant she felt grounded. Though aching for the loss of the love of her life, her son's rose let her know, somehow, that everything would be alright. Scott's head fell and he choked back tears. "It's you," John said. "You're her son, right?" Scott nodded in the affirmative, attempting to keep his composure as he finished his story. "Which brings me to the last rose. My mom died a week ago today. I'm on my way to say goodbye and to give her one final rose. Her life has been defined by her flowers and the men who gave them to her. For my grandfather, my father, and myself, I will give her this one last gift." And with that, Scott finished his beer, stood, and offered his hand to John. "I'm not sure why I came in here, but I'm glad I did. Thanks for listening." "It was my pleasure," John replied earnestly, shaking Scott's hand. "Thank you for sharing your mother's roses with me." As Scott turned to leave, John put a hand on Scott's shoulder. "That was only 11. You said there were 12? Where is the last rose?" "It's my mom," Scott answered with a smile. "You see, my grandparents hadn't thought of a name before her birth, thinking it would be bad luck. When my mom was born healthy and her dad gave her the first rose, my grandparents quickly agreed on her name. My mom, Rose, is the 12th. Scott again turned towards the door and left without another word. John would never see him again. Alone once again, John came to a firm decision. A quick phone call to his mom let her know the flowers at the wedding would be roses, just as the love of his life desired. His mom protested a bit but soon relented as John was resolute. John didn't call his bride-to-be to let her know of his decision. He wanted to tell her in person, and he also had a story to share. He paid his tab and left the bar, no longer apprehensive. He jumped in his car and headed straight home, stopping only once, at a florist, to buy a single red rose.